The morning Jada Mbeki found out she was carrying 6 heartbeats instead of 1, the doctor's hands shook so badly he dropped the ultrasound wand twice. 6, he whispered, as if saying it louder might make it untrue. Mrs. Castellano. There are 6 of them. Jada didn't answer right away. She was staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the cracks the way she used to count the seconds between her father's footsteps coming up the stairs back home in Enugu, a habit from a childhood spent listening for danger. 6 weeks ago, she hadn't even known his name was real. 6 weeks ago, she'd thought Dominic Castellano was simply a quiet, expensively dressed stranger who tipped well and asked too many questions at her sister's restaurant. She hadn't known he ran half the ports on the eastern seaboard. She hadn't known 3 rival families had put a price on his head before she ever touched it. And she certainly hadn't known that whatever ran in Dominic Castellano's blood, fury, hunger, a refusal to let anything in his world stay small, could apparently be passed on 6 times over in a single, reckless month. How, she finally said, sitting up so fast the paper gown crinkled like gunfire, is that even possible? The doctor had no answer. But somewhere across the city, in a marble office that smelled of cedar and old money, a man who had buried 2 brothers and forgiven no one in 15 years was about to receive the only news that had ever made him cry. This is the story of how it happened, and what it cost. Jada had moved to the city 3 years earlier with a nursing degree, a suitcase, and a promise to herself that she would never again be the kind of woman who needed anyone's permission to leave a room. Her sister Ifema ran a restaurant in the part of town where old Sicilian bakeries and new Nigerian grocers shared the same block, and Jada helped out on weekends between hospital shifts, mostly because the smell of jollof rice and fresh bread reminded her of a home she missed more than she admitted. Dominic Castellano started coming in on Thursdays. He never ordered the same thing twice. He never brought bodyguards inside, though Jada noticed the black sedan that idled outside for exactly as long as he sat at the corner table. He tipped in cash, always folded the same way, and he watched her, not with the leering attention she'd learned to deflect since she was 14, but with something quieter. Curiosity. Maybe even respect. "You don't smile for customers," he said one evening, the 4th Thursday, after she'd corrected him, politely but firmly, on the proper way to eat ifo riro. "I smile when something's funny," she said. "Not when someone's paying me to perform happiness." Something shifted behind his eyes. Dominic Castellano was a man used to being managed, by lawyers, by lieutenants, by women who wanted what his name could buy them. He was not used to being corrected. "What's your name? You've been coming here a month. You could have asked the menu." "I'm asking you." "Jada," she said. "It means princess. Don't let it go to your head, I didn't choose it." He laughed. Ifema, watching from the kitchen doorway, would later say it was the first time she'd ever seen that particular customer's shoulders drop an inch. What Jada didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for another 2 weeks, was that Dominic Castellano had inherited his father's empire at 26, the same week he'd buried him. The Castellano organization controlled freight contracts up and down 3 states, owned politicians the way other men owned dogs, and answered to no one. Dominic had spent 15 years making sure of that, burying rivals, burying doubt, burying, more than once, men he'd once called friends. He had also buried, quietly and completely, any belief that he was capable of wanting something he couldn't simply take. His consigliere, a sharp, silver-haired man named Salvatore Brun, noticed the change before Dominic did. "You've been smiling," Salvatore said one night, looking up from a ledger of numbers that represented several people's very bad decisions. "I haven't seen you smile since your brother's funeral, and that one wasn't even genuine." "I don't smile." "You smiled twice this week. Both times after Thursday." Salvatore closed the ledger. "Dominic. Whoever she is, be careful. Men like us don't get to have nice things without someone trying to take them." Dominic didn't answer. He was already thinking about Thursday. What followed was not a courtship in any sense Jada recognized from books or movies. Dominic Castellano did not do small. He showed up at the hospital after her overnight shift with coffee that cost more than her hourly wage. He had her favorite Afrobeat artist's entire discography pressed onto vinyl because she'd mentioned once, in passing, that she missed her father's record collection. He took her to the top of a building she didn't know he owned and told her, with the bluntness of a man who'd run out of patience for games, that he didn't know how to do anything halfway. "That should scare you," he said. "Should it? I'm not gentle, Jada. I don't know how to want something a little." She studied him, really studied him, the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to the exits in any room out of habit rather than fear, the loneliness he wore like a coat 2 sizes too large. "Then don't want me a little," she said. "But understand something. I am not yours to own, Dominic Castellano. I'm not a contract. I'm not territory. If you want me, you'll have me as an equal, or you won't have me at all." It was, Salvatore would later say, the only time in 15 years he'd watched Dominic Castellano lose an argument and look grateful for it. The month that followed was a blur. Neither of them tried to slow down. Dinners that ran past midnight. A weekend in a borrowed villa upstate where Dominic, for the first time since his father's death, slept 8 uninterrupted hours. Long drives with no destination, where Jada talked about Inugu and her mother's cooking and the ache of being far from home, and Dominic, astonishingly, to anyone who knew him, listened more than he spoke. Neither of them was thinking about consequences. They were thinking about each other, fiercely, completely, the way people think when they've spent years guarding themselves and finally, set the guard down. The fainting spell happened at the restaurant, 3 weeks after that. Ifema found her sister crumpled against the walk-in cooler, and within the hour Jada was in an emergency room bed with Dominic pacing the hallway outside, having terrified 2 security guards and 1 very junior doctor simply by existing. When the senior physician finally walked the ultrasound technician through the imaging a second time to be sure, then a third, the room went very quiet. Miss Mbeki, the doctor corrected himself, glancing at the chart, "I want you to stay calm. There's no easy way to say this. You're pregnant. With sextuplets. 6 separate, viable pregnancies." Jada's first feeling was not fear. It was disbelief so total it looped back around into something like laughter, the kind that escapes a person when the universe hands them an absurdity too large to argue with. 6, she repeated. "How is that even possible?" The doctor explained, in careful clinical language, about hyperovulation, about the rare confluence of factors that could lead to multiple eggs being released and fertilized in a single cycle, a phenomenon documented but exceedingly uncommon, more common in families with a genetic predisposition to multiple births. He mentioned that spontaneous sextuplets, while exceptionally rare, were not unheard of in medical literature. None of it made it feel less impossible. Dominic Castellano, when the doctor told him, because Jada, exhausted and overwhelmed, asked him to be the one to say it out loud, went pale in a way none of his enemies had ever managed to make him go. Salvatore, waiting in the hallway, would say afterward that he'd seen Dominic stare down armed men with steadier hands. 6, Dominic said. He sat down hard in the plastic hospital chair, looked at Jada through the window of the recovery room, and put his face in his hands, not from despair, but from something that looked, to anyone watching closely, remarkably like joy too large for his body to hold. "My father," he said quietly, "spent his whole life building something to leave behind, and in the end there was only me. One son to carry a name built for an army." He looked up. "And now there are 6. News like this does not stay quiet in a world built on information as currency. Within a week, 3 rival organizations knew that Dominic Castellano, sole heir, sole vulnerability, the only thread holding his father's empire together, was about to become the father of 6 children at once, all by a woman with no family ties to organized power, no leverage, no protection but her own sharp tongue and Dominic's increasingly obvious devotion. To his enemies, this was not romantic. It was an opportunity. 6 heirs, said Marcus Calloway, head of a rival syndicate that had been waiting 15 years for the Castellano line to show a single crack, means 6 pressure points. Find the mother. Find the leverage. Salvatore brought the threat to Dominic directly, the way he always did. No softening, no spin. "They'll come for her," Salvatore said. "Maybe not today. But they will." Dominic had already considered it, had been considering little else since the hospital. He had spent 15 years building walls to keep his world from touching the people he cared about, and he had failed spectacularly, in the most literal sense possible, in under a month. Then we make her untouchable, he said. Starting now. Jada, when she learned the scope of what she'd married into, because Dominic, to his credit, told her everything, all of it, the ports and the ledgers and the bodies he would not pretend hadn't happened, did not run. Ifema begged her to. Her mother, reached by trembling international phone call, wept and pleaded for her to come home to Enugu, sextuplets and all. But Jada had spent her whole life refusing to be small, and she was not about to start now, pregnant with 6 reasons to be braver than she'd ever been. I'm not asking you to approve of his world, she told her sister. I'm asking you to trust that I know exactly what I'm walking into, with my eyes open, for the first time in my life. She set conditions instead of fleeing. She would not live behind walls she couldn't leave. She would finish her nursing certification. Her children, and she said her children pointedly, daring anyone in that family to suggest otherwise, would know their Nigerian grandmother's cooking and their father's Sicilian grandmother's prayers in equal measure. And Dominic would build something new with his inheritance, not just guard what his father had hoarded. You don't get to keep me, she told him, by keeping me safe in a cage. You keep me by becoming someone worth standing beside. Dominic Castellano, a man who had never in his adult life been told what to do and lived, found himself doing exactly as she asked, not because he feared her, but because for the first time in 15 years, someone had looked at the entirety of his life and decided to stay anyway. The attempt came, as these things do, when they were least prepared for it, a supposedly routine shipment inspection at Pier 14 that Salvatore had cleared 3 times over. Callaway's men, 11 of them, moving in formation that suggested professional military training rather than street muscle, with one objective only: take Jada, use her as leverage to fracture the only empire on the eastern seaboard still capable of resisting a hostile merger of crime families. They had not accounted for 2 things. The first was that Jada Mbeki had grown up in a household where her father, a former military officer turned civilian security consultant, had drilled self-defense into both his daughters from the age of 8, not out of paranoia, but out of the plain, practical wisdom of a man who'd seen what the world could do to women who didn't know how to fight back. The second was that Dominic Castellano, despite 7 months of pregnancy having made Jada stubbornly insistent on visiting the pier herself to inspect a shipment of medical supplies bound for a clinic she'd quietly been funding, had never once in 15 years gone anywhere without contingency. When Callaway's men moved on the warehouse, they found Salvatore's people already waiting, alerted by a single silent alarm Jada herself had insisted be installed. What followed was fast, ugly, and entirely one-sided. No shots were fired. Dominic had given strict orders that nothing was to risk Jada's safety, and his men followed that order with the discipline of soldiers who understood exactly what failure would cost them. Callaway's crew was disarmed, detained, and, in a move that surprised even Salvatore, released the next morning with a message instead of a body count. Tell Callaway, Dominic said, standing over the man left to deliver the warning, that he just showed me exactly how much he fears a woman and 6 unborn children. Tell him I find that fear very, very educational. It was, in the underworld's particular grammar, a declaration of dominance far more chilling than a massacre would have been. A man who didn't need to kill to win was a man who controlled everything. Jada went into labor 8 weeks early, on a Tuesday that started ordinarily and ended in a delivery room crowded with more specialists than either of them had known existed. 6 neonatologists. 6 warming cribs, lined up in a row like a held breath. Dominic stood at the head of the bed, holding Jada's hand hard enough that she'd later tease him about the bruises, and watched as, one by one, in the space of 11 extraordinary minutes, his children arrived. A girl first, the doctor announced, 3 pounds, 2 ounces, screaming with the kind of fury Salvatore would later call, with a rare grin, unmistakably her father's daughter. Then a boy. Then twin girls, born 90 seconds apart, identical down to the same furious wrinkle between their brows. Then another boy. Then, last, the smallest of the 6, a boy so quiet in his first moments that the entire room held still until, finally, he let out a thin, indignant cry that broke something open in Dominic's chest he hadn't known was still capable of breaking. 6, Dominic said again, for what felt like the 100th time in 5 months. But this time it wasn't a question. It was a vow. Jada, exhausted beyond words, looked at the row of incubators and then at the man beside her, a man who had once buried his own father believing he'd inherited nothing but solitude and obligation, and who now stood surrounded by 6 small, furious proofs that he had been wrong. "How?" she whispered, smiling despite everything, "is this even possible?" "I don't know," Dominic admitted, pressing his forehead to hers. "But I'm not asking anyone to explain it. I'm just grateful it happened." A year later, the Castellano compound, once a fortress designed to keep the world out, had been rebuilt, room by room, into something that could hold 6 cribs, 2 grandmothers who'd finally agreed to share a kitchen, and a woman who still refused, even now, to be anyone's quiet wife in the background of her own life. Salvatore, watching Jada referee a debate between Efima and Dominic's aging Sicilian aunt over whose christening recipe would be served first, allowed himself, for once, an unguarded laugh. "Your father," he told Dominic, "built an empire to leave behind for 1 son. You're going to leave behind 6 rulers who actually like each other. He'd have no idea what to do with that." Dominic, holding his quietest son against his shoulder while the boy slept through the chaos with the same unbothered calm he'd shown since birth, looked across the room at Jada, princess by name, sovereign by nature, the only person who had ever walked willingly into his world and rearranged it instead of breaking against it. "Good," he said. "Neither would I, once. She taught me otherwise." Outside, the city kept its old rhythms, ports humming, rivals watching, the business of power continuing the way it always had. But inside those walls, for the first time in 2 generations, the Castellano name meant something other than fear. It meant 6 heartbeats that had started as an impossible question, and become, against every rational expectation, an answer.